My name is Claire Hutchins, and this is the story of the night my father walked into a restaurant and finally understood who his daughter actually was. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a house on Monument Avenue that my father never let anyone forget he owned. The house was beautiful, one of those tall red brick Victorians with wide front steps and black iron railings and windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything inside look golden. My father, Robert Hutchins, had inherited it from his own father, and he treated it less like a home and more like a credential. The house on Monument Avenue was proof that the Hutchins family mattered. Everything in our lives was organized around maintaining that proof. My father was a commercial real estate developer, the kind who'd made significant money in the 90s and spent the decades since protecting it. He sat on the boards of 2 local banks. He golfed at the Country Club of Virginia on Maywell Street. He had opinions about everything and delivered them like verdicts. He was not a cruel man, exactly, but he was a man who had confused success with wisdom and spent 30 years acting accordingly. My mother left when I was 8. Not dramatically, not with screaming and thrown dishes, just quietly, over a long weekend, while I was at my grandmother's house in Fredericksburg. She sent a letter explaining that she needed a life that had room in it for her. I didn't fully understand that letter until I was much older. By then I understood it completely. After she left, it was just me and my father in the house on Monument Avenue. He hired a housekeeper named Gloria who made dinner and kept things orderly and was the most consistent warm presence in my childhood. My father was present physically, home most evenings, at school events when they mattered to him. But emotionally he was somewhere else, somewhere governed by calculations and appearances that I could never quite access. I had one half-brother, Derek, from my father's first marriage before my mother. Derek was 12 years older than me, worked in the family real estate business, and had inherited my father's talent for making you feel like you were taking up slightly too much space. He and my father had a relationship I can only describe as a mutual appreciation society, built around golf and deal-making and a shared certainty that most people didn't measure up. I was not, in their estimation, measuring up. My choices were the problem. After high school, I'd gone to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which my father approved of, but I'd studied political science instead of business, which he didn't. After UVA, instead of coming back to Richmond to work for Hutchins Development the way Derek had done, I'd gone to Washington, D.C. to work as a junior staffer for a Virginia state senator. My father called this playing at politics and gave it 18 months before I came to my senses. I didn't come to my senses, by his definition. I stayed in D.C. I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I learned every corner of Virginia state politics, every relationship, every pressure point. I moved from junior staffer to senior policy advisor over 4 years, developed a specialty in economic development and infrastructure, and built a reputation as someone who could translate complex policy into plain language and get people in a room to agree on things they'd been fighting about for years. At 28, I joined the staff of Governor James Whitfield, who had just won a tight election on a platform of economic revitalization for rural Virginia. I became his deputy chief of policy. I worked 80-hour weeks. I traveled every county in the state. I drafted legislation and sat in rooms where real decisions were made and earned the trust of a man who did not extend trust easily or cheaply. My father knew I worked for the governor's office. He didn't consider it a real career. Real careers made money and built things you could point to. What I did was, in his words, government work, which he said in the same tone other people used for unfortunate weather. Derek reinforced this whenever possible. Over holiday dinners, he'd ask about my little job in a tone that suggested it was something I did to pass the time between more serious endeavors. My father would nod along, and I'd sit across the table from them both and feel the particular exhaustion of being misread by people who'd decided not to bother reading accurately. Things got worse after my father turned 62 and started talking about legacy. Legacy, in Robert Hutchins's vocabulary, meant the real estate business, the house on Monument Avenue, the family name attached to commercial developments across central Virginia. Legacy meant Derek. Legacy did not, apparently, mean me. He started making this clear in small ways and then in large ones. I was excluded from family financial discussions I'd previously been included in. Decisions about the business were announced to me rather than discussed with me. When my father's accountant put together a family wealth overview for estate planning purposes, Derek was in the room. I was not. I told myself it was his prerogative. It was his money, his business, his life's work. I didn't want his money. I had my own salary, my own apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of DC, my own career that had nothing to do with him. If he wanted to leave everything to Derek, that was his right. What I couldn't quite forgive was the contempt. The assumption not just that I'd chosen differently but that I'd chosen wrong, that my work was lesser, that I was lesser. That part had a weight that didn't reduce with time. The birthday invitation arrived by email in September. My father was turning 65, and Derek had organized a dinner at Le Maire restaurant inside the Jefferson Hotel on Franklin Street in Richmond. Le Maire was the kind of place that required a reservation weeks in advance, with a menu built around seasonal Virginia ingredients and a wine list that needed its own reading glasses. It was exactly the kind of restaurant my father chose for important occasions, which meant it was also exactly the kind of restaurant where appearances mattered. The email from Derek said, Dad's 65th dinner at Le Maire, October 14, 7 p.m. Family and key business partners. Heirs and serious contributors to the Hutchins legacy only, no deadbeats. Don't bring your daughter, she'll only make it political. That last sentence was addressed to my father, I realized, and I'd been copied accidentally, or maybe not accidentally at all. Derek was capable of either. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my own email, closed the original, and called my father. I got Derek's invitation, I said. Good, he said. He says not to bring me. A pause. Derek's organizing the evening. I'm not going to override him on the details. I'm your daughter. Claire. His voice was tired, or made itself sound tired, which with my father amounted to the same thing. Derek said you'd make it political. You know how you are at family events. It's my birthday. I want a nice evening. You know how I am, I repeated. You can come for dessert on Sunday, he said. We'll do cake. It'll be fine. I thought about the years of Sunday cakes. The consolation prize version of family belonging. The clear message that I was welcome in small doses, on terms that didn't inconvenience anyone, separated from the events that actually mattered. No, I said. I'm not coming for Sunday cake. Suit yourself, he said. I texted him later that evening, just to be clear. I won't come. Have a good birthday. His response, good. We don't need the drama. I put my phone in a drawer and left it there for an hour. Then I took it out and called my friend Naomi, who had been my closest friend since our Yuba days and who had an excellent instinct for when I needed to be talked off a ledge and when I needed to be told I was right. She let me talk for 20 minutes. Then she said, you know what's funny? Dad's birthday is the 14th. What? October 14th. That's the governor's birthday dinner at the Jefferson. I stopped. Are you serious? The annual fundraiser. The one you've been helping organize for 3 months. At Le Maire. The governor's birthday was a significant annual event in Virginia political circles. Every October, a dinner was held in his honor at a restaurant that could hold the guest list of 40 or so people who mattered most to his administration and his political relationships. This year, because I'd been handling the logistics, it was at Le Maire inside the Jefferson Hotel. October 14th. 7 in the evening. The same restaurant. The same night. The same time. I sat with this information for a long moment. You didn't plan this, Naomi said. Obviously I didn't plan this, I said. But you're not going to tell them. I thought about good. We don't need the drama. I thought about heirs and serious contributors. I thought about 20 years of Sunday cakes. No, I said. I'm not going to tell them. The next 2 weeks I went about my work without mentioning the coincidence to anyone. The governor's dinner was fully planned, the guest list confirmed, the menu finalized, the seating arrangements set. I was, as Deputy Chief of Policy, seated at the governor's table, as I always was at official functions. This was not a special arrangement made for the occasion. It was simply the protocol. I wore a dark green dress I'd bought at a boutique on King Street in Alexandria, the kind of dress that was appropriate for a formal political dinner without trying too hard. I drove down to Richmond from D.C. On the afternoon of the 14th, checked into the Jefferson Hotel, which is one of the most beautiful hotels in Virginia, all marble floors and palm court ceiling and photographs of the presidents who'd stayed there. I had a glass of wine at the bar and reviewed the evening's notes and felt, honestly, quite calm. The governor's party arrived at 7:15. James Whitfield was in his early 60s, silver-haired and vigorous, with the particular warmth of a politician who had started out genuinely liking people and had somehow managed to continue doing so through 2 terms in office. He was with his wife Eleanor and a group of senior staff and political allies. He found me near the entrance to La Mer and shook my hand and said, "Claire, I've been told this whole evening was your doing. It looks wonderful." "All I did was make the calls," I said. "That's all any of us do," he said. "Make the calls. Come on, let's get seated." We were at the best table in the room, positioned near the center, visible from most of the restaurant. This was standard for a governor's dinner. You didn't seat the governor in a corner. I was looking at the menu when I heard the commotion near the entrance. Not a loud commotion, just a shift in the room's atmosphere, the way a restaurant goes slightly quieter when something has interrupted the normal flow. I looked up. My father was standing just inside the entrance to La Mer, in his good suit with his pocket square, flanked by Derek and 3 men who were clearly the business partners. The maitre d' was speaking to them. My father was scanning the room with the practiced ease of a man who'd been coming to restaurants like this for decades. And then his scan reached our table and stopped. I watched it happen. The moment of recognition. The confusion that followed recognition. His eyes went from me to the man seated to my left, whose face he would have known from the news and from the Richmond Times-Dispatch and from the official portrait in the state capitol building. Governor James Whitfield. Seated next to his deputy chief of policy. His daughter. The maitre d' was directing my father's group toward their table, which was across the room from ours. My father moved, but he kept looking. Derek noticed and followed his eye line and did his own version of the freeze, less dignified than my father's but with the same essential quality of a man encountering information that doesn't fit his existing file. I turned back to my menu. About 10 minutes later, when the room had settled into dinner conversation, Governor Whitfield leaned toward me and said quietly, "The man at the table by the window keeps looking over here. Do you know him?" I glanced over. My father was indeed looking. Derek was looking. Their table mates had noticed something was happening and were uncertain whether to ask about it. "That's my father," I said. The governor looked at me with the expression of a man who could read a room. "Ah," he said. "Should I say hello?" I thought about heirs and serious contributors. I thought about we don't need the drama. "If you'd like," I said. James Whitfield was, among his other qualities, a man who understood the significance of gestures. He had built a political career partly on the ability to deliver a moment at the right time. He stood up from the table, not making a production of it but not being subtle either, walked across the restaurant floor toward my father's table. I watched from where I sat. I watched my father stand, reflexively, the way you stood when a governor walked toward you. I watched them shake hands. I watched the governor say something and gesture in my direction. I watched my father look at me from across the room with an expression I had never seen on his face before. The governor returned to our table, sat down, picked up his wine glass. "Nice man," he said. "He seems very proud of you." "Did he say that?" I asked. "Not in words," the governor said. "But I've been reading people for 30 years. He smiled. "You should go say hello." After dinner. I waited until the dessert course had been cleared and the dinner was winding down. Then I walked across the restaurant to my father's table. Derek watched me coming with an expression he couldn't quite control, something between defensiveness and a recalibration happening in real time. My father stood up when I reached the table. For a moment neither of us spoke. His business partners were watching with the polite attention of people who understand they're witnessing something private. "Claire," he said. "Dad," I said. "Happy birthday." He looked older than he had at Christmas. Or maybe I was seeing him differently, from a new angle. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I know," I said. "The governor." He stopped. Started again. "You work closely with him." "I'm his deputy chief of policy," I said. "I have been for 3 years." Another pause. Derek was looking at the tablecloth. "I didn't understand," my father said, "what that meant." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." This was not an apology. It was barely an acknowledgement. But from Robert Hutchins, a man who had built an entire identity around being the one who understood things while others didn't, it was something. It was a crack in something I'd stopped believing could crack. "I'd like to have dinner," he said. "Just us." "Soon." "Okay," I said. I shook hands with his business partners, who were warm in the way that people are when they'd just revised their assessment of someone. I looked at Derek, who met my eyes for a moment and then looked away. I kissed my father on the cheek, which surprised us both. Then I went back across the restaurant to say goodbye to the governor and his wife, collected my coat, and walked out into the Richmond October night, onto Franklin Street where the Jefferson Hotel glowed warm behind me and the old city spread out in all directions, full of its own complicated history. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute in the cool air and thought about Sunday cakes and consolation prizes and a birthday invitation that called me a deadbeat. I thought about 20 years of being the wrong kind of daughter. I pulled out my phone. No messages from my father yet. Maybe there would be one tomorrow. Maybe there wouldn't. Maybe the dinner he'd mentioned would happen and maybe it wouldn't. With my father, you didn't make predictions. What I knew was this. I hadn't staged anything. I hadn't arranged the coincidence. I hadn't done a single thing except show up to do my job, which I'd been doing for years while he'd been deciding it didn't count. The world had simply made a point I'd been trying to make for a long time. Sometimes it works that way. I walked to where I'd parked on Main Street and drove back to the Jefferson, to the room I'd reserved for the night. I had an early call with the governor's office in the morning about a rural infrastructure bill, and then the drive back to D.C., and a week full of work that mattered. I'm 31 now. I still work in the governor's office, though we're in the last year of his second term and everyone is thinking about what comes next. I'm thinking about running for office myself. State legislature first, probably. We'll see. My father and I had that dinner. At a restaurant in Richmond called the Roosevelt on East Gray Street, just the two of us, the following month. It was careful and honest and not resolved, because these things don't resolve, they just evolve if you're lucky. He asked real questions and I gave real answers, and somewhere in the middle of a shared plate of country ham and biscuits something small and stubborn shifted between us. He told me he'd looked up my work after the Jefferson dinner. Read the policy papers with my name on them. Read news coverage of the infrastructure legislation I'd helped draft. He said, in his particular way of saying things that cost him something, "You've done real work." Not. "I'm proud of you." Not. I was wrong. But for my father, "You've done real work" was its own kind of earthquake. "I know," I said, and smiled at him, and meant it without bitterness. Derek and I are not close and probably won't become close. Some distances are too established to close entirely. But we are civil in a way that contains respect now, which is more than I had before. The house on Monument Avenue will go to Derek, or it'll be sold, or something else will happen with it. That's fine. I have my apartment in Capitol Hill and my work and my own life built on my own terms, and none of that required his approval to exist. But I won't pretend the Jefferson Hotel dinner didn't matter. I won't pretend that watching my father freeze in the doorway of La Mer was nothing. Some moments are just exactly what they are. A man seeing his daughter clearly for the first time in 20 years because the room she was sitting in finally spoke a language he understood. I didn't need the governor's table to be worth something. I was always worth something. But I'm glad, in some private corner of myself, that my father finally had a reason to see it. My name is Claire Hutchins. When I was 30, my father told me not to come to his birthday dinner. 2 days later, he walked into the same restaurant, and the governor smiled at me, and my father went silent. Some stories write their own endings. This one wrote mine. There's a photograph on my desk in my Capitol Hill apartment. It was taken at a state event earlier this year, one of those formal occasions where everyone stands in a line and smiles at the camera. I'm in the middle of the frame, shaking hands with Governor Whitfield, both of us laughing at something that was said just before the shutter clicked. You can't tell what we're laughing at. It doesn't matter. What matters is the expression on my face, which is the expression of a person who belongs exactly where she is. Not performing belonging. Not hoping for it. Just inhabiting it, naturally, the way you inhabit a life you built on honest ground. I sent a copy of that photograph to my father without a note. He texted back 3 words. You look good. For Robert Hutchins, 3 words was a paragraph. A paragraph was a speech. I saved the text. I still have it. My name is Claire Hutchins. I am 31 years old. I built my career from nothing but work and time and the stubborn refusal to need my father's permission to be real. And when he finally walked through the right door at the right moment, the room told him everything I'd been saying for years. I was always here. He just had to look.